Please welcome the panel on Ukraine, Present Perils and Future Prospects, moderated by Adjunct Senior Fellow on the Council on Foreign Relations, Gideon Rose.
Hi there, and welcome everybody. We have a very big subject, a very short time, and a lot of very impressive people, so we'll get right to it. There are a lot of issues on the foreign policy and global agenda, from China to the Middle East, from immigration to climate change to trade. And yet there are many who feel, and I think a number of us on this panel feel, that there is one that literally the current future of the world depends on in real time, and that's Ukraine. 2+ years ago, a global superpower with nuclear weapons decided to literally take over an entire country and wipe it from the face of the earth. It started, of course, years before, but the scale of the invasion and the radical aims of Putin and what that would mean for global order, not just for Ukraine and not just for Europe, but for all global order and the future of the 21st century, shocked almost everybody. The course of the war since then has gone back and forth, surprising again almost everybody. The pessimists were surprised at first. The pessimists were surprised again when Ukraine surged forward. The pessimists were enheartened and the optimists surprised when the counteroffensive stalled. We've had a grinding stalemate that's been moving forward slightly on the Russian side as the American aid was stalled. And then just recently, an aid package from Washington has reset the table yet again. 2 years into the conflict, where are we? Where are we going? What can we do? What must we do? Evelyn, what is the state of the war right now, and what does the aid package that was just passed mean for what's going to happen next?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much to the Milken team for inviting me and for organizing this really important panel, and I'm honored to be here with all of these very active, engaged, and clever, direct gentlemen. I want to add one thing to what you said, Gideon. I think it's really important right now that people understand that, as Garry Kasparov put it on the stage this weekend at the McCain Institute's Sedona Forum, he said, Russia is the last empire. So this is a fight that we are fighting against imperialism. He wants to go back to a system that predates World War II, that we know will lead us back to world wars if we don't stand up for the international order, for the boundaries, for the rights of peoples. So I want to just add that. Where are we now? Well, Ukraine has been holding on in the ground. We know there's been a lot of media coverage on the war in the east and in the south on the border. The Russians are trying to they've taken some little villages because U.S. assistance slowed down for 6 months. The Ukrainians had to ration their munitions. As a result, again, the Russians have made some advances, but none of them are strategic. So you still have a line that the Ukrainians are holding. Now, on the other hand, if you look at a different, as the military says, domain, if you look at the maritime domain, if you look at the lines of communications, so the trade that Ukraine has reestablished, those of us who have followed the war know that in the beginning, the Russians tried to bottle the Ukrainians into the Black Sea and basically to cut off trade. Why? Because Ukraine relies on trade, like most countries, in order to fuel their economy and then, of course, fund the war. The Ukrainians have amazingly, over the last, I don't know how many months, 6 to 12 months, they have reopened trade through the Black Sea using their own innovation, their own munitions. So while there is a stalemate on the land, I think it's important for us to understand that Ukraine now is trading through the Black Sea, and it's about $6 billion going forward annually for them. That's significant. It's iron ore, it's grain. Remember when people were starving? They're still starving, but the grain is getting out from Ukraine to the rest of the world. In addition to that, we see some, and I know we're going to talk about what's happening on the international stage with regard to the frozen assets, the Russian money that was seized by the international community that can be provided to Ukraine. So there's movement now, there's conversation. I'll leave it to others to cover that. But essentially, the state of the war is such that Ukraine now is slowly getting munitions, so that ground stalemate that I talked about, it can change, but not immediately. So Ukraine is holding the line. Once they get more equipment, more munitions, they could potentially counter, but that's now at least 6 months away. There's a manpower issue on both sides. Again, we can get into that. The Ukrainians have the will, they have the resolve. When I was there in March, a colleague from the New York Times talked about the fact that his colleagues, Ukrainian colleagues, went forward to the front lines where the soldiers were rationing munitions. And even though they were rationing munitions, fighting for their lives, they were still determined. And so the Ukrainian determination is important to remember. Ukraine has won strategically. Russia will never control Ukraine again. But the war must be won, and the war will be won largely because of this political will and the determination of the Ukrainian people.
From your lips to God's ears, as some people say. Dmitry, as the war goes forward, it has almost become a kind of war of attrition in which the Russian advantages are significant. And the Washington-Kyiv relationship seems to be souring at a time when it should be bonded ever more strongly. What is your take on the state of the war and what can be done to shift it now?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I speak with Ukrainian leadership, military leadership, and folks on the front line on almost daily basis. And it's a very tough slog right now. The fortifications, unfortunately, were delayed in terms of being constructed. They started constructing them late last year. They should have started earlier. They're not in a great shape that we saw the Russian fortifications that they had built, that the Ukrainians confronted in their counteroffensive. And they have a huge manpower disadvantage. They passed the mobilization law just recently. It's going to take effect in a few weeks. Probably delayed, unfortunately, because it's going to take time to train that mobilized force before they're going to be ready to be sent to the front. We got to invest much more in training. One of the big reasons for why the counteroffensive failed is because the training was very limited. You can't take a soldier and expect them to be in combat ready position in 6 weeks, which is really what we were doing with these people that we were sending them to the UK and other places. It takes 6 months in the United States military to train a combat-ready individual, much less, a brigade that can work together and conduct combined arms operations. So this is going to take time. It is absolutely a war of attrition. When people ask me how long will this war go on, I say it's been going on for 10 years. It can unfortunately go on for another 10 years, right? The problem with this conflict is that you have both sides that are fighting for territory, even though territory is not fundamentally how you win this conflict. Right? From Putin's perspective, what he wants is control of the country. And taking a random village in the Donbass that most Russians can't even pick out on a map does not get him closer to that objective. For the Ukrainians, I think the problem with their counteroffensive strategy was that taking back territory does not actually end the conflict. Right? You can imagine a situation, say hypothetical, where they succeed in taking back everything to the 2014 borders, Crimea, Donbass, etc. And my question to them has always been, why would the war end? It just moves the boundary, right? And the war ends when Putin decides that it ends. And to beat Russia, you can't just win on the battlefield in Ukraine. You have to take the war to Russia, right? You have to do long-range strikes against Russian cities, Russian infrastructure, energy grid, etc., like they're starting to do now, much to the chagrin, unfortunately, of Washington. But that is essential to win the war of attrition, to break the will of the Russian public, to sustain this war, because right now the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg do not feel this war. They're not getting mobilized, they're sitting in their Michelin star restaurants, sipping coffee, eating good food, and the war is far away. You have to bring the war to their infrastructure, to their military infrastructure and energy infrastructure that sustains this war. You have to make them feel it like people in Kyiv feel it when they're seeing missile strikes every day against their energy infrastructure.
Okay, Dmitry, I'm going to do the same thing I'm going to do to Bill in a bit, which is I'm going to press you for a second on this, because the obvious counter answer from many in Washington and many even around elsewhere, not in Washington, would be that that sounds nice and would be effective perhaps in changing Russian attitudes or making them feel scared, but the potential escalation that might provoke would be such a dangerous situation that we want to avoid it. And the unfortunate reality of fighting a nuclear-armed, very superior, serious power is that you have to sort of limit the fighting to the actual theater because you don't want to provoke a larger Russian reaction. What would you say to the argument that what you just said was reckless, like having no-fly zones or U.S. troops on the ground or things like that?
Well, I think where you draw the line is you don't provide Ukraine with long-range weapons from the West that can target Russia because that could trigger an escalation, but you help Ukraine build those weapons themselves, whether it's drone strikes or even missile capacity, right? The Ukrainians in the Soviet Union days had a number of plants that were manufacturing significant weapon systems, missile systems for the Soviet Union. They have the Grom-2 missile, they have the Neptune missile, the Moskva cruiser in the Black Sea. They can increase the range of those systems, they can increase the capacity of their production. You know, when I was in Kiev last, I visited a drone factory and I saw one individual there in flip-flops cranking out on a machine 1 drone per month. That is not mobilization of the Ukrainian economy. And to get there, I passed body shops, people working on BMWs and all kinds of things, right? The Russians have mobilized their economy. They are operating 3 shifts in their factories to produce drones, produce missiles. Ukraine absolutely has to do the same in order to win.
Okay, let's turn to the domestic front. Liev, you have a personal relationship with Zelensky that comes from your acting background as well as your visits there and your support during the war. Talk to us a little bit about the home front in Ukraine and your sense of it and what the connections and how it can be helped.
Well, obviously, the passing of this recent aid package is a game changer, and I wish that we spent a little more time celebrating events like that, not just for Ukraine, but for our own polarized political system. We don't spend enough time marking what we can achieve when we're united, and that was an extraordinary achievement. From what I understand of that package, for the most part, it is about replenishing military aid that's already been sent to Ukraine, for the most part. But hopefully what it'll allow the Ukrainian government to do is to continue to pay pensions and to bolster social services like medical aid, welfare, because those are the issues that we're really concerned with. I think for us, what we're really trying to do is to maintain private and public funding for the local Ukrainian NGOs who are providing this sort of desperately needed humanitarian aid on the front lines and in vulnerable communities. Examples of that is there's a group that we work with called Rescue Now. There's about 600 plus elderly people trapped in Kharkiv, and this group is their lifeline to the world. They do daily check-ins with them. They bring them food kits, warming kits. And you know, you'll see in a lot of these situations, when you watch the news, it's inevitably an elderly woman bleeding from the head, walking around confused by a shell. And the reason for that is that the young people have all gone to the big cities, and the elderly people who are in great Ukrainian tradition, very tough and don't like Russians very much, think nothing of it and want to stay in their homes with their goats and their animals and their life. And so these are the communities that are really, really vulnerable right now. Another thing is what people don't realize about a situation of war is need is this really moving target. Things like medicine for simple diabetes management, heart conditions, becomes incredibly difficult to get. And so we work with organizations like Ukraine Assistance Organization, UAO, who provides thousands of people these medications on a monthly basis. These groups are completely dependent right now on our funding. Because public funding is very difficult for a lot of these groups to access, and hopefully we'd like to change that too. We'd like to teach them how to apply for it, to organize them. We are very fortunate to have the pro bono services of Ropes and Gray, a terrific international law firm, who vets and verifies all of our groups, and also helps them with the M&E framework so that they can set up networks and establish the lines of communications with some of the bigger organizations like USAID. That distribution model for delivering aid in these areas hasn't really grown as fast as the need has grown. Everyone's well-intentioned, but just by way of an example, Humanitarian Outcomes came out with a report this past year that, no, that was in 22. The first report I saw was of the 2.6 billion that had been allocated to Ukraine, only 6 million had made it to the local Ukrainian NGOs on the ground. And they're doing 90%, this is from that same report, of the operational work on the ground. They're taking the risks, and rightly so, because they have the intelligence, they have the access, they have the skin in the game. And so it's really important that we continue to support them so that the government is able to defend the country. And they're not too strapped by putting all of their resources into these aid situations. That's sort of what Blue Check is trying to do.
Let me take a two-finger for you as well. You're a big star. You've made a movie about this.
Are we talking about size or?
You literally can't. Why is there such a hard time getting Americans to understand the stakes of what's going on in Ukraine? And why have you not been able to, even with movies on the subject, not been able to sort of, break through the noise out there? And how can we break through the noise?
I have a very personal opinion on this, which is that I feel a little bit like we've lost touch with what our role in our own democracy is. For me, a lot of people say that I'm Ukrainian because I have great-grandparents from Kyiv and Odessa, but I don't know any Ukrainian. And the truth is that's really just a story that I used to get on CNN. I'm in this because I'm American. I'm in this because of my grandparents' generation and the values that they had. Obviously, they inherited those values from their Ukrainian parents. But I believe we owe a debt to that generation, and we owe a debt to our freedom and our democracy. And that's what's being challenged right now. And I think if we don't recognize that, it truly is at our own peril. Having said that, having spent a lot of time on the ground working with these extraordinary Ukrainian NGOs, I'm one of those optimists who know how this is going to go. The Ukrainians are going to win. I know that for sure in my heart, just from having associated with these people. The issue is how long will it take and how many people will have to die?
That's something that one feels whenever one goes. Every time you go to Ukraine, if one has gone to Ukraine during the conflict, you cannot come away but being struck by the resistance. However depressed you may end up being by the situation, you come away deeply impressed and wanting to stand by the people who are fighting to protect themselves and, by extension, all of us. It's really impressive.
The morale, which I think is a huge part of this aid package, is a shot in the arm for that Ukrainian resilience and that morale. For them to know that we're with them is incredibly powerful.
So, Bill, the great challenge in this war has not been Ukrainian morale or Ukrainian military talent, but resources to fight off and defeat a larger, better resourced foe. There is a large pool of Russian money, which, as Evelyn said, is sitting there and could potentially be taken. You're in favor of taking of it. At a panel yesterday, I heard Ken Griffin, when asked about this, say, oh, that was a terrible idea because it would destroy confidence in the global financial system and lead people not to invest in U.S.-related entities so that they couldn't be confiscated. What is the opportunity and what are the risks of using Russian sequestered money to support the war effort?
Well, first of all, let me just say that Ken Griffin is just plain wrong on this issue. A week after the war started, the Western governments, the Allies, got together and we froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. The expectation was that the war was going to go on for, well, actually, the expectation was the war was going to last a week and Russia would win and that would be the end of the story. And in the worst case, the expectation was 3 months and the whole thing would be over. The war has now been going on for 2 years and 3 months, and it's cost a lot of money to a lot of people, a lot of Westerners, and more importantly, it's destroyed, Russia has destroyed, Putin has destroyed somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion of property and resources in Ukraine. And so before we get to Ken Griffin, the obvious thing is Putin's created more damage than the money that's been frozen. It seems to me, and it seems to anybody who looks at this, that it's sort of the morally right thing to do to take that money and give it to Ukraine. And originally, the conversation was, to the extent that people were talking about this, was that this money should be used to rebuild Ukraine. And I have a different view, which is that you can't rebuild Ukraine if Russia occupies it, and so this money needs to be used to defend Ukraine. Ukraine needs to be defended before it's rebuilt. And so it's certainly the morally right thing to do. We've also been funding Ukraine. When I say we, I mean all of the Western allies, and we've seen all these fights now going on about money for Ukraine. The money was delayed here for 6 months. The money was delayed in Europe by the Hungarians. And as time goes on, more and more money is going to be delayed. And then we get to the issue of November 5th here in the United States. There's a reasonably high probability that Donald Trump will become the president. If Donald Trump becomes the president, I think he's made it pretty clear that he doesn't like Ukraine and he doesn't want to support Ukraine. And so I think that there's a high probability he becomes president, and there's a high probability if he becomes president that he cuts off Ukraine funding. And that means that half the money of all the money that's currently going to Ukraine will be cut off. And so if Ukraine runs out of money, then we end up in a situation where Putin probably does win. He has. At the end of the day, this is a resource war. We saw what was happening before the 61 billion aid package was approved. The Ukrainians were running out of artillery and bullets and other things. And if Ukraine loses, Putin doesn't stop there. That's not the end of his conquest. He then moves on to the Baltics or Poland or Moldova. If he goes on to the Baltics or Poland, they're NATO allies. And then we're faced with a terrible dilemma. Do we then, based on our treaty obligations, do we go to war with Russia because they're NATO allies? Or alternatively, I can imagine a bunch of people going on CNN and Fox and saying, why would we go to war with Russia over Estonia when no one can find it on a map? And so we're then faced with this terrible situation where we either go to war with Russia or we let Putin take over the Baltics and Eastern Europe, which will ultimately, one way or another, lead to World War III. So I think it's both the morally right thing to confiscate, and well, let me step back. We don't have that problem if we grab the $300 billion. The $300 billion prevents that from happening. And so it seems to me that, as I said, it's the morally right thing to do. It's the geostrategic right thing to do, and it's the politically right thing to do. Why should we be paying for Ukraine when Putin can be paying for Ukraine? But coming back to Ken Griffin, and this is one of the two arguments that I've heard a lot, mostly coming from hedge fund guys on Wall Street, which is that somehow if we take this money, it's going to ruin the international financial system and no one's going to trust anyone ever again. And the answer is, that might be true if just the US were to do that by itself. But to do this, we would do it with the Europeans, we would do it with the Brits, we would do it with the Canadians, the Japanese, the Swiss. And then where do people who are worried about this kind of thing happening keep their money? You know, where does the Chinese or the Saudi princes keep their money? Do they buy Iranian rials and Argentine pesos? I don't think so. At the end of the day, everybody's stuck with reserve currencies, and they will keep their money in reserve currencies. There's one last argument which you didn't mention, which is the argument that somehow this is lawless to do. And I would argue that invading a neighboring country and creating $1 trillion of damage is a lawless thing to do, and there should be some legal consequence for doing that.
Let me follow up on something and just comment on something that Bill said, because this goes back to what I said at the beginning. There are places in the world where military tragedies are happening. There are places in the world where you could imagine things spiraling up to World War III or giant future global conflict. There's only one place where you have a terrible extraordinary military tragedy occurring, the human suffering of war on a vast scale that dwarfs anything else going on the planet right now, and the overlay of potential great power conflict, nuclear war, global stability. It affects everything. That's why Ukraine matters so much and why it is so frustrating for many of us when we see other issues which, however important or objectively much less so, gain the headlines, the attention, the political capital, and the resources that can and should be devoted to this, whatever one's view of how to play this game. Ilya, over to you. 2 years ago, we were looking at potential coups in Russia and instability and crowing that, oh, Ukrainian resistance was going to lead the Russian side to crack. And now Putin seems to have stabilized control, has re-engineered a war economy and a national, almost neo-fascist state devoted to prosecuting this war in his leadership. Tell us about the Russian front and what, if anything, can be done on that front.
Thank you very much for that question. I want to ask the question for the audience. Guess what is the largest international unit fighting inside Ukrainian army? Russian. Guess which is the second largest international unit fighting in Ukrainian army? It's also Russian. Guess which is the third largest international unit fighting for Ukrainian army? No, it's not Russian. It's Belarus. It's Belarus, but it's the same. It's the state which is the source of aggression. These are the largest units which are fighting inside Ukrainian army, trying to liberate our land. Right now, there is a growing resistance movement inside Russia, which is already approximately 7 times larger than the size of units which are inside the Ukrainian army. You probably have heard about some of our accomplishments inside Russia. Almost exactly 1 year ago, there was an attack on the Kremlin Dome, which was done by the Russian resistance. Right now, many people are talking about attacks on the oil refineries, which are impossible without people on the ground who are actually navigating the drones, which are trying to kick Putin out of this war. We need to understand the origin of this war. Is it some territorial dispute between Russia and Ukraine? Obviously not. It's way deeper than that. And then when Putin himself was saying that it's a clash of civilizations, obviously I think it's more his personal clash, but still, that's the way he sells this conflict to Russians. And that's why, by treating the consequences of the war, by providing money to Ukraine, by saying that let's just stop where we are, we are not treating the origin of the problem. And the origin of the problem is Putinism itself. You cannot stop the war. Many people are asking me in the United States how the war can be stopped. And the first answer that we were hearing in 2022, Ukraine would fight back, liberate the territories, would come to the borders of 1991. But without removing Putinism, it means just one thing, that the front line would be alongside the internationally recognized Ukrainian borders, but the missiles would be still flying. The war would still continue. The only way how you can resolve this question, how you can defeat the aggressor, is actually to defeat Putinism. And you know what? When people ask me, what is your main problem? I say, of course, my main problem, my main enemy is Putin, but main problem is actually in Washington, D.C. Because whatever our units are doing in Russia, we immediately are getting calls, please don't do it. Please stop. A year ago, there was a first major operation of Russians on the Russian territory, and we are those missiles who are flying back to to Russia when they are shooting peaceful Ukrainian civilians and others, because Ukrainians, they don't have missiles. They have drones, but to navigate drones, you need to have somebody on the ground. So we are that retaliatory force which actually can do things. And when these drones were hitting Kremlin, the White House was calling Bankova, is office of President of Ukraine, and say, what the heck are you doing there? When our guys were coming onto Russian territory of Belgrade last June, we immediately got calls, what the heck are you doing there? This year, when we made a major operation in Kursk and Belgrade was the largest one, and again with these refineries, we even got a very senior US official coming to Ukraine, to Kyiv, and saying, please stop this. Guys, how we can win the war if we are not fighting back? It's simply impossible. And many people say that our objective is not to win the war, our objective is not to make Ukraine lose. But that's exactly what led us in the situation of this war of attrition, where Russia is spending way more than the combined West is spending on the defense. We are now celebrating, and we are in Ukraine are very thankful. I'm saying once again, thank you, really thankful guys for providing this 61 billion that you have provided to us. But Russia has spent hundreds of billions. Right now, 1/3 of the Russian budget is military-oriented. They outspent the combined West in terms of the defense weapons that we can use in the proportion of 10-1. That's the current situation. We are not able to outspend Russia. The only way how we can win, how we can stop the war, how we can mitigate the risk for the Western nations, and in particular Baltic countries, Eastern Europeans, is to actually win the war. There is no other option. The war needs to be won, and we cannot do it without you. Thank you.
Okay. This is great. I'm going to drill down with each of you on some specific issues. So, Evelyn, I'm going to go back to you. And I really liked what you said about Crimea, because what many people who, even those who follow the war, well, somewhat closely, may not realize is that as much as the dramatic counteroffensives and offensives on land have played out and ground each other and cost so much, I mean, arguably the most interesting aspect of the war militarily has been the defeat of the Russian Navy, which is really interesting when there is no Ukrainian Navy. So how the Russians have managed to sort of do so poorly in the south and the Ukrainians do so well. And it leads me to my version of Dmitry and Ilya's things, which is my preferred, more aggressive strategy would be going after Crimea. I'm not sure we should go after Russia, and I'm not sure we should go, have lots of Russian national, troops on the field. But my question to you would be, you mentioned the upsides of the war in the Black Sea or in the around Crimea and in the area. Is there an opportunity to shift to, if you have a stalemate on the ground, even as you hold the line in the Donbass, is it possible for Ukraine to make significant gains on Crimea, and what would be required for that to happen?
Yeah, Gideon, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I didn't want to speak too long. But if I had kept on going, I would have talked about the fact that I am incredibly encouraged by what the Ukrainians, with the help of their Russian colleagues, have been able to do behind the Russian lines, whether it's in Crimea or, frankly, on Russian territory. And I think that we shouldn't tie the Ukrainians' hands and tell them where or how they should use the weaponry that we are giving them. So I'm very forward-leaning, much more willing to take risk because we want Ukraine to win. We're providing them with longer-range artillery. Use it. Use it on military targets. I mean, that is clear. But the Ukrainians have been abiding by the laws of war. So we need to trust them. There was one incident where they did something, I don't know if you guys were involved, but where they assassinated a daughter of, they were actually, the target was an advisor to Putin in Russia. Our government clearly made it clear to the Ukrainians that we are not going to support Ukraine if they are going to assassinate people. I don't know this, but I'm gathering between the lines because they haven't tried that again. So as long as the Ukrainians focus on military targets, and the Kerch Strait Bridge is one of them. That's the bridge that links the Russian mainland with Crimea, which again is Ukrainian territory occupied by the Russians. But it's a logistics corridor. It's a rail and train, truck corridor. Traffic goes back and forth, providing resources into Crimea. What is Crimea? People live there, yes, but in effect, it's a base. It's a large logistics installation that the Russian military relies on heavily. If the Ukrainians can continue to degrade the capabilities, the defensive capabilities, and force Russians to move out of Crimea, that's a huge victory for them that can lead the way to a strategic military victory. You know, you talk to any generals. I used to teach at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College back when I was a young person. And they always say logistics is how you win or lose a war, and Crimea is a logistics hub. So I do think that makes a tremendous difference in terms of taking out the installations there. Striking the oil refineries is also important because the Russian tanks, the Russian military runs on fuel. They need the fuel. Of course, I understand the political sensitivity if there's an impact on the global oil price, and that's a big if, because I've spoken with economists who argue that there's not necessarily a correlation and you have to look at which refineries are struck. But I think the resourcefulness of the Ukrainians is what we have to ultimately focus on. The fact that they were able to take out all of these Russian ships and a submarine in the Black Sea is because of their innovative capacity. They built these sea drones. These are their own manufacturing capabilities, you know, in action. And they took the risk. So the innovative quality, the determination of the Ukrainians, and frankly, these patriotic Russians who are helping them, that's what we should focus on.
That's a great lead into my next question, which is to Dmitry. There's been a lot of talk about a new World War I and trench warfare and attacks, but one of the most interesting aspects of this war has not just been that kind of war, but the incredible tech war going on behind the scenes. This has been a laboratory for modern warfare. NATO, China, everybody is watching this incredibly closely because the scale and rate of innovation technologically, any of the attacks of this year would have beaten any of the defenses of last year. Any of the attacks of last year would have beaten the defenses of previous years, and not just because of more sandbags on the ground, but because of the complexity of the drone warfare, the integration of the various combined arms tactics, and so forth. Dmitry, you are an expert in modern technology. How is the tech war playing out, and what, if anything, can be done, as Evelyn said, to liberate Ukrainian creativity and create sort of technological advantage by leveraging the US and Ukrainian tech industries?
So one of the interesting things about the drone war in particular is how little American technology is actually being used in Ukraine, not because it's not being provided, but because it's not very good, to be honest with you. And the reason it's not very good is the drone that's effective today is not going to be effective tomorrow, because the countermeasures that are being deployed by both sides in electronic warfare, in the tactics that are being used, are changing on a day-to-day basis. And unfortunately, one of the big problems we face both on the technical side, but even in the broader conflict, is that the United States has not allowed military advisors to be in Ukraine, physically in Ukraine. Some of our allies do it, but we don't. And that severely limits our ability to learn from this conflict by being directly in the front lines, integrated into the Ukrainian forces as advisors, not as combatants. And that is why I've led a group of military analysts on a trip to Ukraine to actually learn and take back some of the things that are happening on the battlefield back into the US military, and appreciate how the conflict is changing and changing the nature of warfare. Really, really important to get those learnings in directly into our defense industrial base, which right now cannot update their software fast enough and be agile enough to deal with the countermeasures that are being deployed. And that's why the Ukrainians are actually asking for money to buy Chinese drones, because American drones are great.
Just to think about that for a second. I want to pause that. Ukrainians are asking for money to buy Chinese drones because the American defense industrial base is at such a pathetic state that we cannot supply competitive short-term supplies to our allies under mortal threat. Yeah, that's pathetic, frankly.
And there are two reasons for that. One, our drones are orders of magnitudes more expensive. You can buy Chinese drones with various capabilities for $5,000, $10,000. Our American drones are $50,000, $100,000 drones, and if you're going to lose it in 6 hours, you'd rather lose the cheap one. And two, because the updates are not agile enough, and the Chinese drones are much more reconfigurable, and you can swap out antennas, change frequencies much more rapidly than you can with US drones. So we are not learning from this. One more point on Crimea that I want to add. Probably, arguably, the biggest success post the Battle of Kiev, when Ukraine was able to save itself, that you've seen on the battlefield is a reopening of the grain corridor, allowing Ukraine to export its #1 export, which is wheat. And it's important to understand how that happened. It is not because the Black Sea Fleet is destroyed. It is not destroyed. About a quarter of the Black Sea Fleet is destroyed, but they still have numerous capacities, both in terms of ships, submarines, coastal batteries, naval aviation. If they wanted to take out those civilian ships that are leaving Odessa, they certainly have the capability to do so. Why haven't they done that? It's because Ukrainians have started striking Russian ships, commercial ships that are coming out of the port of Novorossiysk on the Black Sea that is really critical for the Russian exports of oil as well as wheat. And as soon as they started striking that, the Russians came to the table and agreed to a covert agreement where basically if you don't strike us, we will not strike you. That allowed the Ukrainian exports to be reopened. There's a lesson here that if you strike Russia and their critical assets, they negotiate, they come to the table. So right now, the Ukrainian energy grid is in really terrible shape. The new strikes that the Russians have been launching over the last 4 or 5 months have decimated their power grid, destroyed a lot of the transformers that are very difficult to replace. How do you stop that? You stop it by striking the Russian energy grid and make them feel the pain, right? And that is the only path to victory.
Okay, Bill, I'm going to follow up with you on something that's been a disappointment, and I'm not sure why. Americans always, when they want to do something but they don't want to get too involved, their initial response is to slap sanctions on. There were very significant, very major sanctions put on Russia, and many people were optimistic, or at least hopeful, that there would be some degree of economic pressure that would force Russia to change its mind, crush the economy, and so forth. But far from destroying the Russian economy, far from preventing Putin from carrying out his war or helping him change his mind, the sanctions seem to have had relatively insignificant effects, and Russia has been able to mobilize, reorient its entire economy and society around the war, and now seems to have a longer and more serious will to fight than the West in general, in Ukraine. Why have sanctions not done more to hurt Russia? And is there anything that could be done on that front to make them more effective?
Well, first of all, this idea that sanctions aren't working comes directly from the Kremlin. So Putin says, sanctions aren't working, we're doing fine, you're hurting by doing the sanctions, and so you should probably just not do any sanctions anymore. That's his spin. So how do we know that sanctions aren't working? They produce these economic statistics. Who produces them? The Russian State Statistics Committee. They lie about everything else. Why would they be telling the truth about their statistics? So, first of all, I don't think the Russian economy is humming on all 8 cylinders. And let's just look at the sanctions for a second. We've frozen more than $300 billion of central bank reserves. We've talked about that. I think an equal amount of oligarch money has been frozen offshore. Russian banks, the Russian government, Russian companies are frozen out of the capital markets. 1 million Russian men have left the country so they don't get killed in war. Another 500,000 have been killed in war. You can't fly anywhere from Russia to anywhere in the West. Planes are basically doing emergency landings because they're running out of parts. It's a mess. This is not a good situation in Russia. But there is one huge truck-sized loophole in the whole system, which is that while we've sanctioned all this stuff that I've just mentioned, which is causing great pain, and don't let anyone tell you it's not, because it is, we still allow Russia to export oil. And in exporting oil, they earn between $500 million and $1 billion a day. And that $500 million to $1 billion a day that they earn legitimately, that we're not trying to stop them from earning, is then used to pay for North Korean missiles and Iranian drones, and it's used to pay for 40% of the government budget to pay for war. And so to the extent that the economy is not in a state of total disarray is because they've allocated all the money that they're getting from oil exports to defense spending for soldiers, weapons, etc., and that's keeping the economy on some type of non-depression scale. And so then the obvious question is, why are we allowing them to export oil? And this is where we get into a really complicated situation, which is that Russia produces 10% of the world's oil. If we were to, say, embargo Russian oil, which is possible, it's possible to do, if we were to do that, then what would happen to the oil price? You take 10% of the supply out of the market, demand stays the same, the oil price goes through the roof, $250 a barrel, maybe more. And so, and of course, nobody wants oil at $250 a barrel because then we have a whole other range of issues that we're all talking about here in this conference with inflation and cost of living problems and so on and so forth. And so we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Russia gets the money from exporting oil to buy bombs to kill Ukrainians, and then we give Ukrainians money to fight back the Russians. And so something's got to give somewhere. And what Putin is hoping is that we run out of the will to give Ukrainians money and then he wins. And it would seem to me that this is the moment when we should be thinking about an energy policy where we somehow increase the oil output. And it's not possible to increase the oil output overall by 10 million barrels, but let's just say we leaned on the Saudis, we leaned on the Emiratis, we leaned on ourselves. America is the biggest oil producer in the world. We could come up with an energy policy. And by the way, in the same way that Germany, who was totally dependent on Russian gas, became totally independent of Russian gas in 1 year, we could come up with an energy policy to lean on our allies to increase oil output. And we should use the leverage that we have to increase the output ourselves, and then embargo Russian oil. And if we did that, if it was possible, and I don't think it's possible to embargo 100% of Russia's oil exports, but if it was possible to do that, they'd be out of business in 9 months and the war would end.
Ilya, I want to go to you for another area of disappointment that many of us have had. Watching this war play out, it's obviously been such a disaster for Russia, even though they've managed to stay in, even though he's managed to keep the fight going. The objective catastrophe that this has meant for Russia as a country in terms of the squandering of its future, its reputation, its resources, its population. Why hasn't that produced more domestic dissent inside Russia? And why does Putin now seem to be stronger than he was at the beginning rather than weaker? Or is this just a false front, like on the sanctions, that he wants us to think that he's in good position? Why have there been no follow-up to the coup? Why has there been a restabilization of Putin's regime?
For a very simple reason, because people are not suicidal. They act rationally, and rationally they do understand that to go barehanded against all the oppressive apparatus in Russia is suicidal. What could be the answer for this? And here, again, I think it needs to be a coordinated position of all the Western nations. There is one call which is very clear: just leave Russia. And some of our common friends like Garry Kasparov are saying, let's leave Russia. Okay, but who then would fight if everybody left? And the exodus from Russia during these recent 2.5 years was more than 1 million people, most economically active, most socially dynamic, most persistent. They all left. Now, being in the West, they also ask, what can we do? And most of international governments, French, Germans, Americans, they all say, you do blogs, you do fight the propaganda, but please do not be engaged in actual fighting. Because we don't want to be seen as we are assisting any actual resistance. Because it would be too dangerous for us and the escalation, and stuff. So they are getting dissolved. There is a great desire, actually, on behalf of people to do something. And when there are things which are considered to be safe, vetted by everybody, they immediately start to show up. Recently, there were elections, so-called elections. Obviously, it's scam, it's not elections, for Vladimir Putin. And we saw huge queues coming to the embassies. People wanted to vote, despite that there was no real candidate. But what is the result? Everybody who was doing this, they got listed. Okay, so these all are people, with anti-war position. Why would we do it? It was happening only for one reason, because they were encouraged that this is a safe way, this is a vetted way, this is a normal way, while do the support for the resistance, home front or inside Ukraine is something which you shouldn't be involved in. And to my mind, in the D-Day, in the very last day of this regime, we definitely would see millions of people on the streets. Just they want to see that they are not alone. They want to see that there is maybe small, but still there is a nucleus of people who can oppress the police, who can oppress Putin's security forces, make them stay home, run away, and they will. What Prigozhin's mutiny illustrated very vividly for everyone, that there would be nobody who would defend Putin. All these security guys, they are very brave when they face unarmed people. When they see somebody with arms, they vanish. And that was all the time in Russia. It was in the 90s, it was in the early 2000s, that was the way how Soviet Union collapsed. We never saw any of the official law enforcement people when they saw real danger. And it would be the same thing here. But for this, you need to have this nucleus, which is actually putting up the fight. So that's why I am absolutely certain that this is our prime objective right now, is to facilitate it to grow, to remove all the restrictions of Russians helping this resistance. And that's a lot of my comrades in the opposition, they ask, oh, Ukraine doesn't see us. We say Ukraine sees everybody who is coming to Ukraine, says we are for the resistance and we are ready to help this resistance practically. And those people are always praised, embraced, assisted, and that's the way to proceed.
Okay. I'd like to remind everybody to submit questions. We have a lot of questions. Oh, wow, that me? We have a lot of questions. Somebody, Putin wants to attack us. We have a lot of questions, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but please submit if you'd like to be considered. So here's one that I'm going to throw to you, which is, you've been to Ukraine repeatedly during the conflict. You follow it closely. You also see the American coverage. There's a question here. Is the media and the administration in the U.S. giving us an accurate picture of the real state of the war? How would you gauge what you see when you go to Europe and what you see when you sit here and watch at home? Is the story being accurately presented, or is somebody, in effect, putting a finger on the coverage one way or the other?
I think you have to use your imagination. Because, no, for me, it's all about human interaction and relations. And until I spent a good degree of time there, I had no, for lack of a better term, skin in the game. And having met so many Ukrainians, incredibly resourceful and brave people who are faced with this existential question and make this kind of extremely courageous decision, it reminds me of how I think sometimes in America we feel there is this buffer, this safe distance between us and geopolitical events. And I hope if what anyone gets from walking away from this extraordinary panel is a sense that there is empirical evidence and the reality of the proximity to us and the relatedness is extremely compelling. And if we don't act on that, if we don't ask ourselves individually and collectively, what we can do to ensure the future of our children and our children's children, I think we're making a terrible mistake. And I think sometimes, for me, that point is made clearer when I meet someone face to face than when I see something happening on the news. Although I will say that what got me into all of this was sitting on the couch with my children after 7 years on a television show, and, you know, feeling pretty satisfied with myself that I'd, you know, created a nice nest egg, and here I was with my slightly disconnected children watching the war unfold on TV. And I saw this middle-aged, tall man, red, with Slavic fat pads like me, and I thought, wow, I kind of look a little like that guy. This guy then grabbed his child, hugged his child, and kissed his wife, and I could see him holding back tears as he got onto a bus to board a bus for the front lines of a war in which, in my mind, at that time, in the first week, they were wildly outgunned and matched, I thought, little did I know. And that guy was very little chance he was ever going to see his child again. And for me, as someone who's all about identity as an actor in my business, I'm trying to think, what's my connection to that? Could I do that? Could I pick up my children and hug them and say goodbye to them, knowing that it's the last time, for nothing more than the slim possibility that my death might provide them a future? And I thought, absolutely not. I've completely lost touch with that level of courage, and it's something else, it's values, and it's doing what's right. And that part has come from being there. But it did happen, but you have to use your imagination. You have to put yourself in their position. You have to think like they're thinking. These are critical decisions. That moment when Zelensky, for instance, said, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition, it's an incredibly courageous comment, and I believe it captured all of our collective imaginations. And let's not lose touch with that. Let's ask ourselves in some deeply intimate way why we care about this, and then act on it.
Evelyn, I'm going to bundle a couple of these here for you. Is there any role for diplomacy between the parties in this war, and how does this end?
Well, first of all, you always have to have diplomacy. You have to have the channels open. You have to be ready in case there's an opportunity. Having said that, neither side is interested in coming to the table because Putin, you know, he will only come to the table to try to get a ceasefire if he thinks it's in his interest. Right now, he will not want a ceasefire because he has an advantage on the battlefield, certainly on the ground, as we've heard, because the Ukrainians still haven't replenished their munitions. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are not motivated to try to get a deal with Russia because Putin is not a trustworthy diplomatic party. So they essentially, as long as Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin, I believe there will be no real peace deal. That's because Vladimir Putin is wedded to this neo-imperial idea of having control over Ukraine. So the Ukrainians, and frankly the international community, and I was in the Pentagon when Russia was violating, under Putin's directions, violating international laws, right, left, and center. He is not to be trusted. His word is not to be trusted. We don't believe that he will give up this neo-imperial vision he has. So it will have to be another member of the elite, some other Russian official, some other Russian leader who will make the peace with the Ukrainians. But ultimately what we want is a peace not on Vladimir Putin's terms, but a peace on Ukraine's terms, and one that's in line with international law.
Okay, we can check that against what happens down the road. And on that front, we're coming up on our close here. We're going to hit our mark. I'm going to end with a lightning round to all of you. They invite us back to do this panel next year at Milken. What, if anything, has changed? Dmitry.
Well, hopefully you've had a significant mobilization of personnel in Ukraine military. We've spent months training them to both better defend themselves, but also that they've increased their production of munitions to be able to strike Russia, to start impacting Russian economic base and Russian energy grid in order to deter attacks against Ukraine. That is really the only way that you can get Russia to the negotiating table from a position of strength, where you're able to impact their decision making.
Bill, a year from now, what, if anything, has changed?
Everybody always asks me, how does this war end? And I don't want to leave people with a bad feeling, but the answer is this war doesn't end. Putin doesn't back down, because if he backs down, he loses power, and if he loses power, he dies. And the Ukrainians don't back down because if Putin takes over their territory, the women get raped, the men get tortured, and the children get kidnapped. And so everybody is in it for everything. And sadly, we're going to be sitting here a year from now talking about the same thing.
Evelyn.
Well, I'm much more optimistic. A year from now, Ukraine will be very close to, if not in the European Union. If they pass all the legislation they need to pass, they will maybe also have gained access to some of the interest, at least, from the $330 billion of frozen assets.
Ilya.
I think that a lot of illusions are already gone, and that's not a sign of pessimism. That's a sign of us being more mature and understanding of what's going on. And even here on this panel, I hear what I didn't hear a year ago, that it's all about Putin and Putinism. It's about what's happening in Russia. It's not what is about just the field of war. It's not the victory of Ukraine that would trigger the changes in Russia. It's actually the changes of Russia that would put the end of this war in Ukraine. And as soon as we start to realize this and build our strategy built on exactly that assumption, we will win.
Quick last word. Yeah.
Is this about next year?
Yeah.
I've been preparing that down the whole line.
Yeah.
We will have established self-sustaining local Ukrainian NGOs. We will have helped them to apply and train them to apply for this larger public funding, this multilateral donor base, and they'll be running their own show.
Thank you. For what it's worth, I'm with Bill. I think it's remarkable. I was much more optimistic or pessimistic about different aspects of the war during the first months and the first years, and now I'm going to bet on it being the same next year, and we can repeat this panel then. If so, it'll be a great experience. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you for attending this session. Please join us for a book signing with Dmitry Alperovitch happening now in the Sunset Room.